Ciao.
Excuse me.
All right, well, that's good. Well, I want to, first of all, thank you very much for taking time out, because I know you have important drinking to do later.
Yes, I've got an important appointment at 5:30.
Oh, I just like saying important drinking, because that makes it like, oh, should we call somebody?
It's an appointment to drink. We have an agenda.
Okay.
I did a blog post on the agenda that we follow, because if you don't have an agenda for your drinking, you talk about all the awful things.
Oh, okay. I understand what you're saying. Allison Sheridan, by the way, everybody, Allison Sheridan is here with us, cutting into her drinking time, but for apparently what's a good enough cause to put it off for at least 10 minutes. Right. So earlier this week, Apple did its thing. It's one more thing. Now, let me first of all say it was writing macOS Ken Tuesday night for Wednesday morning that I finally came to a place of peace, a place of understanding with calling it one more thing, because it's the M1.
Oh.
So it's the M one more thing. Now, I don't know if that's what they were doing, but I feel better about that. So I just thought I would share that with everybody.
There has to be a reason.
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's such a loaded phrase. Peter Cohen and I were talking on this show last week about, I mean, he honestly thinks they should have just called it something else entirely, although he did before they did this. I don't know. There were lots of people who were expecting more than we got from the event, because one more thing is such a loaded phrase for Apple. Now, the other thing that honestly might bring you a little bit of peace around the whole thing, if this is actually something that's keeping anybody awake, Tim Cook has used one more thing to signify like a real shift in something Apple is doing. He used it for the introduction of Apple Watch. And I think that was the last time he used it before yesterday, or before earlier this week, rather. So, I mean, it is a term that signifies certainly something for Cook. I think it signifies different things for different people, though, because you expect something shiny to come out of, somebody's pocket or show up on somebody's wrist or something like that. Let me just stop talking and let you talk. What was the thing that impressed you most? What was the thing that impressed you least?
Well, there were a couple of things I wanted to talk about that are maybe a little more off the beaten path. And some of it is just understanding more about, and partly was done through video, of how awesome Big Sur and the M1 chip are going to be together with all of these apps running, whether the developers did any work or not. Mm-hmm. I know they talked about it in the keynote in WWDC, but they talked about Rosetta too, and how some apps maybe even ran better on the M1 than natively on Intel, which kind of tells you how fast they are. I am still just cannot wait to see iPhone and iPad apps on the Mac. But the video I found interesting was the one where they were just showing a whole bunch of developers going, "It's so cool, it's awesome, it's really fast, and I love it." And because of that, I learned that Ken Case, the CEO of Omni Group, plays the harp, and I did not know that before. Apparently, piano is his main jam, but he does have a harp in his house, so I learned that.
Okay.
But I also liked seeing Affinity up there with Adobe in equal billing. So Affinity makes Serif, actually, is the company. They make Affinity Photo, and Affinity is a designer, and Affinity publisher that are all competitors to Adobe, and they're my favorites. So I kind of liked seeing that. But the reason I was excited about seeing them all say it was super easy. I pressed 3 buttons and my app is universal now. The reason I was confident that wasn't just BS was I wrote to Steve Harris a while ago. He's the guy who wrote Keep It and Feeder, the RSS or the podcast feed app I use. Probably the whiniest, biggest complainer I've ever heard in my life of a developer. And so I wrote to him and I said, "Oh, I can't wait to hear how much you're going to complain about this." And he said, "No, actually, I've looked at it, and I think if I spend 2 weeks on this, it'll be more time than I need. That's how easy it's going to be to make my apps work just fine." So those developers were not smoking something saying this is just, or, shills for Apple saying that it was really easy to make their apps awesome on the M1. And so I thought that was fun.
Let me ask you, because you say that you're excited about seeing the iPhone apps on the Mac, and that honestly surprises me a bit. What I immediately think of is when the iPad came out and we didn't necessarily have native apps for everything on iPad, so you could just 2x from the iPhone to the iPad, right? Double the size of it, but it always still felt kind of kludgy. What is it that makes you so excited about getting iPhone apps onto the Mac?
So I can tell you very, very specifically, there are some apps that only run on the iPhone that I can't get to run properly on the iPad or on the Mac, and I like to type on those things and I like to interact on those devices. And the number one is Instagram. And Instagram, I heard yesterday that Instagram has said, yeah, we're not doing ours to run natively on the Mac, which sucks. Really, really irritates me. But I can get them to do, like, I can do a web app, but there's no plus button, so you can't add a picture. And my pictures, I like doing my pictures from my Mac, so you can't do that. There's a way to do a site-specific browser thing and lie and tell it you're an iPhone, and then you get the plus button, and that's all kludgy. So I do run one of those. But when I'm watching videos, like on my iPad using Instagram, I can't hear the audio. I mean, it's just a mess. That is probably the main thing I want to see on my Mac, and I'm not going to get that one yet.
Yeah, I wonder honestly if that's just the I can't use that term. If that's the micturating contest between Facebook and Apple, because there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to do that. Obviously, with everything that you're talking about, I wonder if it's just Facebook saying, no, we don't want to play, or, we want to play the way we want to play, or something like that. Because, of course, Facebook owns Instagram. Yeah,
it may be that they want to make the interface cooler or nicer. But then again, why don't they let you have a plus button when you're on the web app? Like, maybe there is some reason they don't.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought was missing was just an odd thing to listen to, 45 minutes of chip talk and computer talk and processors and system on a chip and not hear anybody say gigahertz.
Okay. Do you want me to say it now? What do you mean? I'm sorry. Because here's the thing. You start to go, I said this on macOS Ken Live, I think, on Tuesday, where basically if somebody shows me a new Mac, I'm like, oh, well, that, looks faster. And I don't really know, like when you say gigahertz, or there's a conversation that I was following between Dave Hamilton, David Sparks, and Christina Warren about memory. She says that the Mac Mini is a non-starter because it does not have 64 gigabytes of memory. It only you can max it out at 16. And she says, well, that's too little. And I say, well, you don't know because you haven't tried it with the M1. But for her, that's just a deal breaker. We can come to that in a second, though. Talk to me about not hearing gigahertz. Yeah, well, so we got 3 computers that all have the same chip, and they said words like 8 cores, they have, 25,000 threads in the GPU. The neural engine has 16 cores, 11 trillion operations per second, but nobody said the clock speeds of these things. So it wasn't like, okay, the MacBook Air's got the, 3 gigahertz one, and the MacBook Pro's got the 3.2 gigahertz one, and nobody said Turbo Boost or, I hate Turbo Boost. Turbo Boost is the bane of my existence, but none of these things were phrases. So is this the identical chip in all of them? Well, there was one, I'm trying to remember, one of them has 7 cores instead of 8, which I thought was a really odd thing. I forget exactly that must have been the MacBook Air versus the MacBook Pro, but don't quote me on that. But hearing things like that, how are we supposed to know which one's the good one if they don't give us a number, right? So I'm wondering, who was yesterday's event for, or this week's event for? Excuse me. I lose track of what day it is. I mean, because on Thursday, seriously, for about the past 9 months, there was a there was a rumor going around before the event that one of the things that Apple was going to introduce at this event was test flight for the Mac, and I thought, you're high, because they may well do test flight for the Mac, but they're not going to give stage time to test flight for the Mac, because that is for a subset of a subset of a subset of the people who buy the Mac. You're saying that you miss hearing gigahertz, but you're more of a geek than most people. Honestly, they were speaking my language when they said 2.5 times faster than the predecessor. right? Because I get that. I understand, oh, faster. How much faster? 2.5 times. Well, how fast was the old one? Well, not as fast as this one. Okay. I mean, I'm there, right? But
but at the same time, you sat through them talking about 5 nanometer processors and 16 billion transistors and 4 high performance cores and 4 high efficiency cores. That wasn't for the non-geek.
Okay. I think, though, they did a good job of explaining that. And honestly, I feel like I came away with more of an understanding from this presentation than I have from most of their other presentations, probably because they say things like gigahertz in the other one that don't really mean anything to me. When they said divided into high performance and high efficiency, I get that. High performance does the heavy lifting. High efficiency takes care of the stuff that doesn't require heavy lifting and doesn't take nearly as much power. I mean, it was almost...
Yeah, that was true. I'll give you that. It did make more sense that way.
Yeah.
Here's another example of what you're saying, and maybe that is what they were doing. I noticed that when they were talking about the cameras in the MacBooks, they didn't talk about 720p, right?
Yeah.
They didn't say, oh, the old one was 720p and now it's 4K or it's 1080p at least. They said it has the latest image signal processor with better dynamic range and machine learning enhanced face detection, so you'll be brighter and clearer and less noise, which is all you actually care about.
Right. And which again goes back to the question of the 16 gigabytes versus the 64 gigabytes. If it does what you need it to do or what you want it to do with what they're offering you, that should be enough. I'm thinking, though, that some people want to hear gigahertz. Some people want to hear 64 gigabytes because we know that 64 gigabytes is a possibility. Day before yesterday, it was a thing I could buy. Now it's not a thing I can buy. And so even if you say to me, look, this is going to do just as well as that last one. In fact, it's going to do better. And you're not going to have to spend the extra money on the RAM. There are some people, and maybe it's just old habits dying hard. Maybe it's gearheads, but there are going to be some people who are like, but I want to spend extra money on extra RAM because that means more better, except we're going to a place that we don't know if it actually does.
I want to separate the things that you've said from the way I actually meant them. I did not miss that they didn't say gigahertz. I just found that interesting.
All right.
I think actually they are probably pretty close to all the same processors, so that's fine. The memory thing is interesting to me. I have a 64 gigs of RAM in my MacBook Pro that I'm using to talk to you right now. But the difference with looking at a lot of RAM is in traditionally, right, if you didn't have enough RAM, your computer would swap out to the hard drive, and the hard drive is spinning, and it would take an hour and a half to go get data, and it was terrible. It was a terrible experience. So it mattered a lot. And then they got SSDs, and wow, man, that was a lot faster even when I didn't have enough RAM, and it would swap to disk. And then they got twice as fast in their SSDs, and now they're probably 4 times as fast. With the memory being on the chip, with the system on a chip, and I'm trying to remember if the SSD, that's probably still separate, but the speed of getting the data around is so much faster. Maybe you can be swapping to that memory or from memory to disk now, and you absolutely would never be able to tell the difference. It's possible, but if you've got a giant file, you've got a huge Affinity photo file, like a 12 gig file, does that mean you can't load the whole thing into memory? That just seems unusual and interesting. I don't know what that means. But remember, none of these were the higher end versions of any of these devices, right?
Yeah.
They were all with 2 USB-C ports instead of 4, USB-C, Type-C, Thunderbolt, USB 4 ports. So I don't think these are the high-end ones.
Right.
So maybe the high-end ones will have more RAM. Or maybe, like you say, it doesn't matter.
That is kind of an interesting point, too, that I mean, we're at the beginning. And I think that the day that Apple introduces this stuff, you want to see where it's going. Well, okay, we can see where it's going now, but this might not be the right machine for you. Might be a great machine for most people. Might even be good for some, I don't want to say low-end pros, but it might be good for some, pros who do things that aren't necessarily so processor intensive or hardware intensive. But yeah, we're just at the start of this whole thing. I do have one last question about the one more thing. I
do have a question for you, too.
Oh, well, okay, go ahead.
If I've got 2 friends who need a new computer right now,
Yeah.
You tell them to buy a brand new off the shelf. Here we go. M1, brand new. Nobody's ever used these before. Probably have a lot of infant mortality. What would you tell them to do? That like they need one now.
Yeah, that's a good question. How flush are they?
Enough.
Because you're going to be able to, I mean, here's the thing. You're going to be able to turn around and sell it, even if it turns out to not be the right computer for you. I mean, it would have to be catastrophic, I would think, for most people. It depends on what they do and who they are and what they use. I think Apple is in enough on this that they know that it's going to work out. So I personally would say go for it. But that's just, I mean, that's just
an interesting conundrum, right? I mean, I would have no fear going into it, but I would also know that I might have to fall back to my other computer. Things could go wrong.
And now you actually may have just answered the question I was going to ask you. Did you open up your wallet or your Apple card or whatever after the event?
And I'm really sad about that. I really like to spend money on stuff I don't need. I'm still waffling a little bit on a MacBook Air. So I've got the 16-inch MacBook Pro with 4 gigs or 64 gigs of RAM and a 4 terabyte hard drive, and it weighs about 125 pounds. Right, this thing's giant. I was hoping for like a 12-inch MacBook, something I could just carry around and like have my downstairs computer, but they didn't do that. Mm-hmm. The MacBook Air is probably that, and it doesn't cost very much at the bottom. But then I'm going to look at it and go, well, I can't do 8 gigabytes. That's ridiculous.
Right.
So I didn't do anything.
And suddenly it's 1 terabyte, and you've got almost as much computer as you had upstairs. Ooh, but you could lose it under a stack of newspapers and accidentally throw it away. So that's good.
Exactly.